I'd like to thank Margarita for a kind invitation to participate in this conference. Also, thanks to both Margarita and Antonis for their heroic efforts in organizing this meeting in what are difficult times. A little comic relief is what we all need, I would say. In any event, I hope you all won't think my paper a joke, especially after Ewan's typically brilliant performance. In a discussion of the Ecclesia Zeusi, Lauren Taft makes the following generalization about transgender costuming in the comic context. True to life representation, and I quote, seems not to have been the central aim of comic costumes and masks. The masks offered a somewhat believable convention for the portrayal of females by male actors. A female mask worn by a padded actor in women's clothes emphasizes, in fact, the theatrical nature of the imitation, end quote. This passage implies what the remainder of the article goes on to argue, namely the dangers of effeminization and the need to obviate the distance between the actor and feigned effeminization. One of the primary features of the iambic poet, whether archaic, Hellenistic, or Roman, is a challenge to their masculinity. These challenges, in turn, yield a kind of revelation of the performative mask within the archaic tradition. The multivocality of the iambic poets, as I have discussed elsewhere, is in part predicated on the problem of correlating the debased poet persona with the performer or author of a given poem. Significant for this argument is the fact that one of the primary morally problematic characteristics of the iambic poet persona lies in the performance of his masculinity. In order to illuminate the poetics of Iambos, today I will explore the poles of masculinity occupied by the iambic poet persona and the effect his masculine stance has on the theatricality of the poet persona. In another discussion of Aristophanic comedy, Tom Hubbard, whose paper tomorrow I will unfortunately have to miss, as not even a plague can get me out of my teaching duties, it seems. He argues that the combination of irony and exaggeration, in especially the parabasis, produces a kind of Verfremdungseffekt, or alienation effect, using Brecht's term, which Tom doesn't, but I think it's in there. The self-deconstructing parabasis is thus instrumental in implicating the poet himself in the human condition, not only a spectator, but also a spectacle, not only iron, but also alatzone, not only superego, but also ego, not only the omniscient creator of comic discourse, but himself, like all his creations, caught up seemingly unawares in the unescapable web of that discourse. And that's the end of the quote from Tom. The parabasis then, precisely as a point at which the poet's voice steps forth and speaks out, usually in ironic and or exaggerated terms, reveals the poet, but specifically the poet as persona, a creation of the drama. In addition, Hubbard argues that it's precisely the critical possibility of the ironic and exaggerated poles that creates this effect. The critic, as a spectacle, is at risk of criticism himself. Aristotle's statement that Crates freed comedy from the iambic form and introduced plots suggests, as Hubbard argues, that there were important late developments in the comic genre. However, Aristotle's comments here and elsewhere certainly confirm a link between the two genres. As Hubbard notes, comedy requires a stepping forward of the poet persona for the process of self-deconstruction to commence. In the performance situation of the archaic iambographer, there is no need for such a move upstage, for that is where the iambic poet persona is always located. Besides this extra dramatic and self-critical step forward, Hubbard offers a third quality of the parabasis, the fact that it's intertextual. Indeed, there is an interesting way in which the archaic iambic poet always performs a kind of intertextuality. For what else are the extended dramas of primary enemies and their families, if not implicitly intertextual? There is a specific kind of intertextuality and a more general kind. So the specific kind is illustrated by the fact that, for example, the Cologne epode is not fully intelligible unless it is plugged into the epode about Lycambes, and perhaps others. The more general kind of intertextuality is illustrated by the way in which, as I've argued elsewhere, the biographical tradition, as part and parcel of the performance of the poetry, interacts with any given performance of a single poem. So the entanglement of the real in the representational matrix of the comic parabasis offers some interesting insights into what Gorgias, no, let's see, I'm trying to go next. Sorry, there we go. Insights into what Gorgias, at least reputedly, may have meant in this passage on the handout. On the PowerPoint, where he argues that Plato was a talented iambicizer. Most obviously and significantly, Gorgias's use of the verb iambidzane here, and I'm putting Gorgias in quotes, of course, it implies a misrepresentation of reality. This kind of misrepresentation as a characteristic mode of ancient iambos will be the focus of the discussion in the remainder of this paper, especially concerning the gender of the iambic poet persona. Within the genre of iambos, from Archilochus to his Roman imitator Horace, and from Hipponax to his Hellenistic imitator Callimachus, the configurations of gender and criticism contribute to a poetics that constantly calls to the fore its status as such. In other words, a constant feature of ancient iambos is its representation of a seemingly real situation that is somehow always styled as impossible. A representation then that could qualify as metafictional. All the more so as, in contrast to the Platonic dialogues in Old Comedy, the first person narrator, persona loquens of iambic poetry, is always overtly implicated in this misrepresentation. And therefore, he and the poetry he represents becomes emblematic of it. Part of being an iambic poet entails the revelation in his own poetry of just how bad he is at being a man. Further, the poet persona's actions in the face of his faulty masculinity represent a situation that could not exist other than in the poetry itself. While I would argue that Archilochus, Hipponax, Callimachus, and Horace all exist as iambic poets only within their iambic poetry, a fact that's highlighted especially through the portrayal of each poet persona's problematic masculinity, unfortunately today, I can only deal with Archilochus's gender troubles. The importance of gender for the genre is emphasized by the fact that one of the most common themes for these poets is sex, and in particular, how the persona loquens relates to and succeeds with his paramours. It will then be useful to show how one can read the extant iambic corpus of Archilochus with certain elements of modern gender theory. Maud Gleason's succinct statement will serve as the starting point, and I quote, "Masculinity in the ancient world was an achieved state, radically underdetermined by anatomical sex," end quote. This formulation is appropriate for a discussion of ancient iambos for two main reasons. First, it focuses on and problematizes masculinity. And second, it recognizes the very real notion of the ancients that masculinity is a practice, not a protuberance. This constructionist notion of masculinity in the ancient world is particularly useful for understanding the genre of ancient iambos. Of course, like most genres of ancient poetry, iambos was primarily a practice of men. However, unlike some genres of ancient poetry, excuse me, it usually involves the narrative self-representation of the persona loquens engaged in various acts of masculine prowess. In other words, iambos, more than other genres, describes the poet persona's practice of masculinity. This iambic poetic process of gender formation can be seen as akin to the process of real gender formation. A prominent methodology for coming to an understanding of these processes entails the realization of their embeddedness in a Foucauldian notion of discourse. As Butler, Judith Butler, argues, and I quote, "It seems that genders can be neither true nor false, but are only produced as the truth effects of a discourse of primary and stable identity." As Butler argues, though, even in the real world, these truth effects show some necessary instability, thereby revealing their inherent performative character. The concept of performativity, according to Butler, not only describes the necessary exposure of the arbitrariness of all gender, but can itself be highlighted and thus provide a means of subverting the stable system. She offers as an example of the latter type of performativity the practice of dressing in drag. When in drag, individuals emphasize the constructedness of gender precisely by confounding the poles of masculinity and femininity. In other words, the often exacting reproductions of the female ideal in the bodies of men present viewers with a contradiction that reveals the gender system as a practice. This formulation has some important implications for the version of masculinity represented on the face of the iambic poet. The kind of instability that has been revealed in the masculinity of the iambigraphic poet persona cannot be said to produce a primary and stable identity, but rather consistently highlights his multivalent nature. In fact, the virulent masculinity so often adduced in the case of Archilochus, and Hipponax for that matter, is not as stable as commentators would lead one to believe. If Butler's notion of performativity is adapted to a theory of the iambic genre, and thereby coupled with the multivalent poet persona I've argued for before, a compelling explanatory model of archaic iambic poetics comes into view. For Archilochus, and again Hipponax, the poet persona does tend to extremes of masculinity. Indeed, one might say that not masculinity, but rather hypermasculinity is evident in their poems. However, as generic exemplars, each of these hypermasculinities is akin to the Homeric ideal of masculinity, which is also intimately connected to its own genre, epic. In this sense, both Homeric masculinity and iambic hypermasculinity are generic ideals, fully implicated in the poetry that creates them. In other words, the poetics of Iambos require such a stance, but unlike the Homeric ideal of masculinity, the iambic version is always linked to threats to the poet persona's status as a male. Therefore, the circle of representation, by including not only the hypermasculine behavior, usually in the form of violent and/or sexual language, but also the fault in the poet persona's male mask, is contradictory. That is, the poet persona is simultaneously hypermale and feminized. A primary feature then of an iambic poetics is to be seen in the poet personas, whether implicit or explicit, self-representation of the faults in his male mask. Simply put, in mocking others, the iambic poet necessarily mocks himself. Let's turn to some actual texts to see what I mean. According to the well-known story, the reputed founder of the genre of iambic poetry, Archilochus, was promised the daughter of a prominent fellow citizen of Paros, who later reneged. The response was severe, and famously, suicide ensued. After the breaking off of the engagement, Archilochus abuses the father Lycambes and his daughter Nabule, both of whom have significant names, Wolf Walker and New Plan, respectively. In the extant poems against Lycambes and Nabule, the retraction of the marriage agreement is never overtly mentioned. There's one fragment, we don't know exactly where it belongs. It is nevertheless always in the background. The focus is on the represented present and the retribution of Archilochus. The epode against Lycambes, of which all that remains is the beginning, it reads, I'll just read Swift's translation. Father Lycambes, what on earth have you done? Who has unhinged your wits, once so firm? Now you're a big laughing stock for the citizens. Especially significant are lines 3 to 4, in which Lycambes is said to be an object of derisive laughter among his fellow townsmen now. Laughter is the double-edged sword of iambic criticism. While it now affects Lycambes, it threatens Archilochus elsewhere. Laughter, like Iambos itself, is a dangerous weapon. In the most famous of his epodes, the Cologne epode, and that's fragment 196a, the present focus of abuse is continued in Archilochus's proclamation of Nebule's impressive set of characteristics. And I won't read the translation, but you all should be able to follow along with me in the interest of time. In this catalog of feminine vice, which compares Nebule to another girl that many believe is her sister, and with whom Archilochus will have later a brief sexual encounter, the focus is again on the present. At line 24, the beginning of the attack on Nebule, Archilochus says, "Now hear this," or "be sure of this. Nebule is too old, deflowered, and she's no longer pretty. This insane woman can go to hell." In a significant parallel, in semantic terms, to the Lycambes epode, Archilochus says that Nebule is bound to make her husband or lover a laughing stock to his neighbors. The function of the woman is merely that of a transmission of blame between the men in the form of dangerous laughter that threatens to infect them both. And this is all the more striking if we think of Nebule as the reason that Archilochus is so angry. In other words, as the source of his blame at an earlier period. The picture is not completely free of problem. Indeed, the next few lines seem to suggest that backstory, especially line 36, where Nebule is called untrustworthy and two-faced, both of which seem to hint at the breaking of the marriage contract that riled Archilochus's abuse in the first place. The breach of Archilochus's masculine status, the reason for his ire, is neatly summarized in a single line, namely fragment 118 West, which is definitely not from the same poem, but likely spoken by Archilochus and representative of a point earlier in his biography than the events of the Cologne epode. Egarhos emoi genoi ta keri nebules began. Apologies to Greeks for my terrible pronunciation. If only I might touch Nebule with my hand or on the hand. With this sentiment, the faults of masculinity are exposed only to be effaced by the reassertion of that masculinity in an act of sexual conquest that turns women into vehicles of blame. The presence of the poetic utterance constitutes an actualization of the blaming process. In other words, it functions as a kind of speech act. The actual situation of performance and reperformance constantly regenerates the censored object, but it also constantly represents the faults of the abuser. The iambic poet persona's failed masculinity is re-encoded in hyper-masculine acts. Every time his horrible treatment of the girl at the Cologne epode's end is performed, the very heinousness of the acts reveal the performer's mask and remind the audience of the source of the poet persona's anger. In this way, the shiftiness of the iambic poet persona is emblematized by his gendered self-representation, both active and fully masculine, but necessarily simultaneously exposed as a fraud. The iambic poet persona always represents himself as, in some sense, an impossible mask. And iambic poetics virtually demands an awareness of the division between performance and reality. This poet, like Gorgias, simultaneously does and does not exist in the text that carries his name. Thank you.